crypto too, I guess, in your view.
Yeah, it's a good week in crypto in the sense that Senator Tim Scott is having a markup this coming Thursday, tomorrow, on the crypto legislation that we sent to the Senate last July. This is the market structure. This is the rules of the road for dealers, individuals, on how they will use digital assets and what the fit-for-purpose regulatory structure would be. So I'm really looking forward to that debate in the Senate tomorrow, and I hope this means that we're moving closer.
For years now, Stellar has existed in this awkward in-between space. Too serious to be ignored, too compliant to be exciting, too useful to fit the rebel narrative that crypto was built on. And now, suddenly, clarity is approaching. Not price clarity, not hype clarity, regulatory clarity. The kind that doesn't pump charts overnight, but reshapes who is allowed to participate at scale. That's where the Clarity Act enters the conversation. And whether you realize it or not, this is one of the most important moments XLM holders have been waiting for without knowing how to name it.
Strong trading volumes and institutional activity as the network prepares for a major infrastructure over.
For a long time, the crypto market thrived on ambiguity. Ambiguity allowed projects to promise everything and commit to nothing. It allowed speculation to outrun reality. It allowed narratives to do the heavy lifting. But ambiguity is toxic to institutions. Banks do not build on unclear rules. Payment networks do not integrate into legal gray zones. Governments do not adopt systems they cannot clearly classify. Stellar has always behaved as if that moment of definition was inevitable. And that's why XLM often feels boring during bull markets. Because it was never designed to win attention contests. It was designed to survive scrutiny. The Clarity Act is not about picking winners. It's about drawing lines. About saying, this is what a digital commodity is. This is what a security is. This is how oversight works. This is who is responsible. Once those lines are drawn, everything changes. Not emotionally. Structurally, projects that relied on confusion suddenly feel exposed. Projects that leaned into compliance suddenly feel ready. This is where XLM's positioning becomes impossible to ignore. Stellar was built with the assumption that regulation would come, that governments would care, that financial institutions would demand predictability, that cross-border payments would eventually need to exist inside legal frameworks, not outside them. That mindset shaped everything. The way Stellar works with anchors, the way it emphasizes transparency, the way it avoids aggressive retail marketing, the way it prioritizes partnerships over hype cycles. None of that made sense to most crypto investors at first. Why play by rules that do not exist yet? Because when they arrive, you don't scramble. You inherit the field. The Clarity Act is important because it removes the fog that allowed people to lump every token into the same category. Once distinctions are made, utility starts to matter more than narratives. Purpose starts to matter more than promises. And XLM's purpose has always been painfully clear. Move value efficiently. Enable cross-border settlement. Support tokenized assets and remittances. Operate within frameworks institutions can trust. That doesn't guarantee price movement, but it does guarantee relevance in a regulated environment. And relevance is the currency that outlasts cycles. Here's the uncomfortable part most people don't like to admit. When regulation becomes clearer, retail influence often decreases. Markets become less emotional, less chaotic, less forgiving to speculation without fundamentals. That's not fun if you're chasing quick multiples. But it's stabilizing if you're holding infrastructure. XLM does not need chaos to succeed. It needs coordination. It needs rules. It needs standards. It needs legal certainty. That's why the Clarity Act isn't a threat to Stellar. It's a filter. It filters out noise. It filters out unserious actors. It filters out projects that were never meant to exist under oversight. And what remains are networks that can operate in the real world. Not the imagined future, the regulated, boring, institutional present. This is where many holders struggle psychologically, because the market taught them to associate success with excitement, big candles, viral narratives, aggressive predictions. But real adoption looks nothing like that. It looks like slow integration, policy discussions, framework alignment, pilot programs that don't trend on social media. The Clarity Act represents that phase. The phase where crypto stops asking for permission and starts fitting into existing systems. And Stellar has already been behaving like that system belongs to it. So if you're holding XLM right now and wondering why it feels like nothing is happening, you might be missing the point. This is the setup phase, not the celebration phase. Once clarity arrives, the question won't be, which token is exciting? It will be, which network can operate at scale without legal friction? That's a very different game. And it favors projects that were built quietly, patiently, and with regulation in mind from day one. The Clarity Act matters because it doesn't create opportunity. It reveals it. And once revealed, there's no going back to ambiguity. What if that's exactly what XLM has been waiting for all along? Clarity does something strange to markets. It doesn't reward the loudest voices. It doesn't care about who shouted first. It rewards the projects that were already acting like the rules mattered before anyone enforced them. And this is where the conversation around XLM quietly shifts from theory into something much more uncomfortable for the broader crypto space. Because once the Clarity Act defines categories, responsibilities, and boundaries, a lot of narratives fall apart. Not because they were malicious, but because they were built on the assumption that nothing would ever be fully defined. For years, many crypto projects thrived by existing in a legal limbo. They promised decentralization without accountability, utility without responsibility, innovation without oversight. That environment rewarded speed over structure. Stellar never played that game. XLM was never about avoiding regulation. It was about making regulation workable. And that distinction becomes massive once clarity arrives. When lawmakers begin drawing clear lines, the first question institutions ask is simple. Who can we work with without risking our licenses? Not who has the highest yield. Not who trends on social media. Who fits? That's the question XLM was designed to answer. Stellar's architecture assumes regulated endpoints. It assumes on-ramps and off-ramps that must comply with local laws. It assumes identity matters. It assumes that moving value across borders is not just a technical problem, but a legal one. Most crypto networks treat compliance as an add-on. Stellar treats it as a foundation. And that difference is invisible in hype cycles, but decisive in regulated environments. The Clarity Act essentially tells the market, you can't pretend anymore. You can't claim you're one thing while behaving like another. You can't blur definitions forever. You can't outsource responsibility to the community when real money and real institutions are involved. Once that happens, projects will be judged less by what they say and more by how they operate. That's bad news for tokens built purely around speculation. But it's good news for networks built around settlement, compliance, and real-world integration. This is where XLM holders need to adjust their expectations. Regulatory clarity does not create overnight pumps. It creates lanes. And once lanes exist, capital flows more confidently. Institutions don't chase momentum. They allocate strategically. They don't need excitement. They need predictability. The Clarity Act reduces uncertainty around classification. That alone unlocks conversations that were previously impossible. Because as long as rules are unclear, legal departments say no by default. Once rules are defined, no becomes, let's explore. That shift is subtle, but it's where real adoption begins. Stellar's role in this environment becomes clearer too. XLM is not competing with meme coins. It's not competing with speculative narratives. It's competing with legacy payment rails. And legacy systems don't get replaced because something is cool. They get replaced because something is safer, cheaper, faster, and legally sound. The Clarity Act doesn't tell institutions which blockchain to use, but it tells them which ones they can safely consider. That alone narrows the field dramatically. There's also a psychological element most people overlook. When regulation becomes clear, retail speculation often slows, but institutional experimentation accelerates. That's not always reflected immediately in price. Sometimes it shows up as stability when the rest of the market struggles. Sometimes it shows up as resilience during downturns. Sometimes it shows up as quiet accumulation that no one notices until it's already done. XLM has historically behaved like that kind of asset. Not explosive, persistent, and persistence matters when the market matures. Another uncomfortable truth. Clarity exposes exaggeration. Projects that claim to be decentralized but rely on centralized control structures will face questions. Projects that promised utility but never delivered will face scrutiny. Projects that position themselves as financial infrastructure without compliance strategies will face barriers. Stellar has answers ready because it asked those questions early. That doesn't make it perfect, but it makes it prepared. The Clarity Act also changes how risk is perceived. Right now, many investors see regulation as a threat because it limits freedom. Institutions see regulation as protection. Clear rules reduce legal risk. Reduced legal risk increases participation. This is why the same regulatory development can scare retail while reassuring institutions. XLM sits squarely on the side that benefits from reassurance. It's a network that thrives when risk is minimized, not amplified. And that's a hard pill to swallow in a market addicted to volatility. But volatility is not the end goal. Function is. Stellar's entire value proposition revolves around being boring in the best possible way. Reliable, compliant, interoperable. The Clarity Act accelerates the market toward valuing those traits again. And once that shift begins, it's difficult to reverse. This doesn't mean XLM becomes the center of attention overnight. It means it becomes part of the plumbing. And the plumbing is where the real value flows. Most people don't think about payment rails until they break. But when new rails are installed, they don't make headlines. They make systems work. That's the role Stellar is positioning itself for. And regulatory clarity is the final piece that allows that role to be taken seriously. So if you're holding XLM and wondering why this feels slower than other narratives, remember this. You're not waiting for hype. You're waiting for permission. And once that permission is formalized, the market stops asking what if and starts asking how soon. That's a very different phase of the cycle. And it's one that quietly favors those who stayed patient while everyone else chased noise. What happens when the market finally rewards preparation instead of speculation? There's another layer to regulatory clarity that most people completely miss. It's not just about what becomes allowed. It's about what becomes default. Once rules are defined, decision-making changes. People stop asking emotional questions and start asking operational ones. How do we integrate this? How does this fit into our existing systems? What risks remain? And in that environment, networks that were built for experimentation struggle, while networks built for coordination begin to shine. This is where XLM's design philosophy quietly pays off. Stellar was never optimized for chaos. It was optimized for cooperation. That sounds boring until you realize that cooperation is exactly how money moves at scale. Banks don't improvise. Governments don't freestyle. Payment processors don't see what happens. They coordinate. They need predictable finality. They need clear roles. They need systems that behave the same way today, tomorrow, and 5 years from now. The Clarity Act doesn't force institutions to adopt any blockchain, but it does force them to think in these terms. Once compliance frameworks are clear, the conversation shifts from, should we touch blockchain at all? To which infrastructure aligns with how we already operate? That's the moment where XLM stops being compared to speculative tokens and starts being compared to legacy rails like SWIFT, correspondent banking networks, and regional settlement systems. And that's a completely different playing field. One of the reasons Stellar has flown under the radar is because it doesn't market itself as a rebellion against the system. It positions itself as an upgrade. And upgrades don't excite people emotionally. They make professionals nod quietly and take notes. The Clarity Act accelerates that professional mindset. It signals that the era of vague definitions is ending. And when vagueness disappears, responsibility increases. Responsibility favors systems that were already built to handle it. Another thing Clarity does is change who controls the narrative. In unregulated markets, loud voices dominate. Influencers, traders, speculators. In regulated markets, lawyers, compliance officers, and risk managers take over. Those people don't care about vibes. They care about documentation. They care about auditability. They care about whether a network can exist without exposing their institution to enforcement actions. XLM's ecosystem was designed with those people in mind, even when crypto culture mocked that approach. That's why Stellar focused on partnerships instead of hype. That's why it emphasized standards instead of slogans. That's why it invested in tooling for regulated entities instead of chasing retail attention. For a long time, that looked like a disadvantage. But clarity flips the incentive structure. When regulation becomes clear, the market stops rewarding rebellion and starts rewarding reliability. And reliability is not something you can fake overnight. It has to be baked in. This is also where XLM holders need to understand the nature of value creation in the next phase. It's not about explosive upside driven by narratives. It's about gradual embedding into systems that move real money. That kind of value accrues quietly. Sometimes price lags behind adoption. Sometimes adoption happens in places you don't see, because institutions don't broadcast experimentation. But once systems are embedded, they're rarely removed. That's why regulatory clarity matters more for infrastructure tokens than for speculative ones. Speculative assets need uncertainty to thrive. Infrastructure assets need certainty to scale. The Clarity Act provides exactly that. It reduces ambiguity around asset classification, responsibilities, and oversight. That allows firms to budget, plan, and commit resources. And when resources are committed, networks that align with regulatory expectations get deeper integration. XLM is positioned to benefit from this because it doesn't require institutions to change how they think. It fits into existing mental models: accounts, issuers, compliance, settlement finality. Nothing about Stellar forces institutions to abandon familiar frameworks. It simply modernizes them. That's incredibly powerful once regulatory barriers are lowered. Another subtle effect of clarity is time horizon extension. When rules are unclear, institutions think short-term. Pilot programs, small experiments, minimal exposure. When rules are clear, planning horizons expand. 3-year strategies, 5-year roadmaps, infrastructure investment. Those longer horizons favor networks that prioritize stability over novelty. Stellar's slow, deliberate development style suddenly becomes a strength. It signals maturity. It signals restraint. It signals that the network isn't chasing trends, but preparing for longevity. And longevity is what institutional capital looks for. For XLM holders, this means recalibrating expectations. If you're looking for constant excitement, regulatory clarity will feel underwhelming. But if you're looking for sustained relevance, this is the environment where XLM performs best. This is not the phase where the loudest token wins. It's the phase where the most compatible system gets embedded. And embedding is sticky. Once a payment rail is integrated into workflows, replacing it is costly and risky. That's why legacy systems lasted as long as they did. Not because they were great, but because switching was hard. Stellar aims to be the system that replaces legacy rails without introducing new chaos. The Clarity Act lowers the friction for that transition. It doesn't force it, but it makes it possible. And possibility is enough. Because once the door opens, institutions that were waiting on the sidelines begin to step in quietly. No announcements, no hype cycles, just steady integration. That's not exciting in the moment, but it's how real infrastructure wins. And if this is the direction the market is moving, the question for XLM holders isn't, when will the price explode? It's, do I understand what kind of asset I'm holding? Because this isn't a lottery ticket. It's a long-term positioning play in a market that's finally growing up. And the moment the market matures is often the moment patience starts to matter more than prediction. What happens when clarity removes the fog and only the systems built to last are left standing? At the end of all of this, the Clarity Act isn't really about laws. It's about behavior. It's about what happens when a market that has lived on uncertainty for over a decade is suddenly told, these are the rules. Now build. That moment changes who stays and who fades. And for XLM holders, this is where the long game finally becomes visible. Because Stellar was never built for a world where rules don't exist. It was built for a world where money needs to move within rules, across borders, across systems, and across trust gaps that already exist. When clarity arrives, excuses disappear. Projects can no longer blame regulators for lack of progress. Institutions can no longer blame uncertainty for inaction. Everyone has to reveal whether they were serious or just loud. This is why the next phase won't feel explosive at first. It will feel quiet, almost uncomfortable, the kind of quiet where nothing seems to be happening, but foundations are being locked into place underneath. That's usually when people lose patience. And that's usually when positioning matters most. XLM doesn't benefit from emotional markets. It benefits from deliberate ones. Markets where decisions are made in boardrooms, not comment sections. Markets where risk is measured, not ignored. Markets where reliability beats novelty. The Clarity Act pushes crypto in that direction whether people like it or not. And that's why this matters more than any single price prediction. Once rules are clear, adoption stops being ideological. It becomes practical. No more debates about whether blockchain should be used. Only questions about which systems can actually be deployed without breaking existing frameworks. This is where Stellar fits naturally. It doesn't ask institutions to reinvent themselves. It doesn't force radical behavior changes. It simply offers a more efficient way to do what already needs to be done. That kind of alignment is rare in crypto. Most networks demand the world change around them. Stellar adapts to the world as it is. And in regulated environments, adaptation beats disruption. Another thing Clarity does is shift the definition of success. In speculative markets, success is measured in price spikes. In mature markets, success is measured in uptime, throughput, compliance, and trust. Those metrics don't trend on social media, but they determine which systems survive. If XLM succeeds in the next phase, many people won't notice at first, because success will look like integration, not excitement, like being chosen quietly, like being relied on consistently, like being boring in the best possible way. That's a difficult mindset shift for retail holders, especially in a space trained to chase adrenaline. But it's also where real value tends to settle. The Clarity Act doesn't guarantee that Stellar wins, but it ensures that Stellar finally gets evaluated on the criteria it was built for. And that alone is significant, because for years XLM has been judged using the wrong yardstick. People asked why it wasn't louder, why it didn't pump harder, why it didn't dominate headlines. Those questions missed the point. Stellar wasn't trying to win attention. It was trying to earn trust. Trust takes time. Trust takes consistency. Trust takes surviving cycles without compromising principles. Clarity rewards that. Once regulators define expectations, the market begins filtering itself. Some projects won't adapt. Some narratives will collapse. Some tokens will struggle to justify their existence. But systems that were already aligned with regulated use cases won't need to pivot. They'll simply continue. That continuity is powerful. It allows institutions to plan with confidence. It allows developers to build without fear of sudden rule changes. It allows capital to flow without hesitation. For XLM holders, this means the next bull cycle may feel different. Less chaotic. Less explosive. More structural. That doesn't mean upside disappears. It means upside is driven by usage instead of hype. By relevance instead of speculation. By integration instead of imagination. And those kinds of gains tend to be more sustainable. This is where patience stops being a passive trait and becomes an active strategy. Not blind faith. Informed patience. Understanding what kind of asset you hold and what kind of environment it thrives in. XLM thrives in clarity. It thrives when roles are defined. It thrives when systems need to connect without friction. And that's exactly the direction the market is being pushed. So the real takeaway here isn't to expect fireworks tomorrow. It's to recognize that the playing field is finally being leveled. Not for traders, for builders, for institutions, for infrastructure. And infrastructure is slow until it isn't. It looks invisible until it's essential. And once it becomes essential, it rarely gets replaced. So if you've made it this far, the question isn't whether the Clarity Act matters. It's whether you're mentally prepared for the kind of growth it brings. Not loud, not emotional, not instant, but real. Because sometimes the most important shifts don't announce themselves. They simply change the rules and let time do the rest. And when the market finally looks back, the only question left is who was already in position when clarity arrived. If this helped you see XLM beyond price and hype, take a second to like the video. Subscribe for calm, clear breakdowns of where crypto is actually going. And comment one word that describes how you feel about XLM right now.